Hello, this is S.K. Williams, and today I would like to talk to you about atheism. Sort of. As usual, I'm actually referring to militant atheism and not atheism in general, so I'm not really being critical of someone just because they are an atheist, but rather looking at those who must insist upon telling you that they are atheists, because religion is evil and stupid and wrong. All religious people are delusional. The Bible is a book of Bronze Age myths that only an idiot would believe in. Atheists have higher IQs. Atheists are underrepresented in prisons. All the great wars were done by religious people. Hitler was a devout Christian. The Catholic Church supported him. The God of the Bible is a genocidal tyrant who condones rape and slavery and murder and all this other horrible things and is unworthy of our worship even if he existed, and only a moron would believe in him. He is a sky fairy, and he is people's imaginary friend. In other words, the Richard Dawkins sort, the Sam Harris sort, the Matt Dillahunty sort, the sort that insists on attacking religion on a continual basis. So really, this isn't about atheists, but in a way it is, because what I'm about to talk about has applications outside of militant atheism. There are even Christians who do similar things. There are regular atheists who do this sort of thing, though not in the context of religion. It's really more of a problem that crops up when people have an ideological bias and don't bother checking the facts, but are clearly invested in arguing for a position regardless. So what is it that I actually mean? I should probably get to the point now. What got me on this was a conversation I had with an atheist recently. He made two arguments that I have heard before and would like to cover in greater detail in a future video, although one of them I have already addressed in a previous video, though I think I could probably do a better job as I become better acquainted with making videos. Still, I will summarize both arguments, but I'm not going to go into detail about either of them because the actual point is not about the arguments that were used, but about a certain mentality that was evident in this conversation. It's a mentality that, while not purely found within the atheist community, is endemic in them to a greater degree than others, and is in fact institutionalized in it. Most other groups don't actually behave this way as a matter of course. If they do behave this way, it is secondary, but the atheist community has effectively framed this as a way of properly approaching a topic, and it is very obvious that it's used to at least appear to win debates when you really don't have an argument. So, what is it that I'm dealing with? Well, the video contrasted the religious method to the scientific method, pointing out that science relies on reason and evidence before it comes to its conclusions, whilst religion asks you to believe in things even though no evidence is offered. This is, of course, rather common fare within atheist videos, because atheists have frequently said that faith is belief without evidence. Another poster and I, however, contested this, noting that faith is not actually belief without evidence, and we were both aware that we were talking about religion, so we were using the religious definition of faith. And I won't go into elaborate detail. I have done so in the past, and will do so in the future, but the main gist of it is this. Both the other poster, who was a Christian, and I denied that faith was belief without evidence, and the atheist to whom we were speaking then proceeded to use a standard rebuttal by saying the Bible defines faith as belief without evidence and appealing to Hebrews 11:1. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. or unseen in some translations. Atheists have frequently said that this verse confirms that faith is belief without evidence, and this is the biblical definition of faith, therefore you must apply this verse's definition every time the word faith is used in the Bible, because the Bible apparently can only have one definition of the word faith, irrespective of any other context. And you must, as a consequence of this, utilize this biblical definition of faith every time the word faith is used within the context of Christianity. This, of course, is absurd, since the word faith has more than one definition, and there is no apparent reason why the Bible must be restricted to only one definition of the word faith, if regular language isn't, other than it being the religious definition, as if religion can only have one definition. But it doesn't really matter, since Hebrews 11:1 isn't actually saying faith is belief without evidence, and certainly not in the way the atheist community tends to claim. Hebrews 11:1 isn't saying that, for example, even though we have no evidence to show you that God actually exists, you should believe in him anyway, and your belief will serve as the evidence that convinces you. That's not what it's driving at. It's not an admission that there is no evidence that God exists, but you should believe, or there is no evidence that Christ rose from the dead, but you should believe. It's actually about achieving a future goal. Specifically, it's about being confident that you can gain your reward in heaven by following Christ. The reason it is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things unseen is because you haven't gotten that reward yet if you're reading that passage whilst alive on Earth. So it's less about things like the existence of God or other topics of the religion, and more about accomplishing something in the future, which is actually applicable even outside of salvation or anything to do with religion at all, and can actually be applied to anything you wish to accomplish in the future. For instance, I'm getting a psychology degree but don't have it yet and can't show it to you, but I'm confident that if I complete the program I will be awarded a degree, and I'm equally confident that I have the capacity to do so. And it is my confidence in my ability to gain my degree that fuels my academic career. The passage isn't saying that faith is belief without evidence. It's arguing that faith is confidence that you can achieve what you set out to achieve. At any rate, I told him this, and also told him that if he would simply read Hebrews chapter 10, as well as a little more of chapter 11, besides just the one verse, this would become abundantly clear, since the other verses that make up this line of thought, like the entirety of chapter 10 or most of chapter 11, actually reference people whose faith led them to accomplish something in the future from when they started believing. So what was his response? Well, he made two. The first response was that he shouldn't have to learn the nuances of my beliefs when my beliefs are obviously wrong. Instead, I should present him evidence if I think my beliefs are correct. This made no sense. I'm contesting a claim he made about what a verse means. He is claiming that Hebrews 11:1 proves that faith is belief without evidence, and it simply doesn't. And I did supply evidence that he was wrong about what Hebrews 11:1 meant. So, all this talk about how he doesn't need to learn the nuances of my beliefs doesn't really make sense. Especially since he's the one who initially made the argument. Shouldn't he be the one responsible to make sure his arguments are valid or that his claims are true? Even if God doesn't exist and Christianity is false, his specific argument that I was addressing is still wrong, and he's the one that decided to make that argument. So why should I have to prove anything, really, past that? The second problem is that he came up with a very complex argument for why God doesn't exist. I'm going to probably butcher it, since I'm going to breeze past it. I'm not really going to address the argument with any sort of detail, either in explaining it or in countering it. In fact, I'm not really going to counter it at all. He asked why there is something, not nothing. He claimed that religious people say that the existence of the universe is their trump card, since they could ask why there is something rather than nothing, but it's the other way around. Why are there 8 planets, for example? Why is there something instead of nothing? If God is so perfect, why isn't he so self-contained that he would have no desires and thus no creation? His argument's a little more elaborate than that, and it involves a claim that engineers never introduce intentional waste, but the universe is very large and wasteful because it has too much in it, and no artist would do that either, and that's why we have Impressionism and Cubism, because the mark of genius is simplicity, and he said that the God I worshipped is clearly not a genius since the universe is too complex. Well, I wasn't really won over by that argument because the argument is stupid, but even if it wasn't a stupid argument, and even if it was entirely correct, it not only doesn't prove that God doesn't actually exist, even if God is an idiot, but it's irrelevant because my point is that faith isn't belief without evidence, and his use of Hebrews 11:1 was incorrect. In fact, his whole framing of the issue is incorrect. The idea that religious people use the religious method and thus throw darts at a dartboard they don't even know exist because they're in a dark room with no light, whilst the scientist builds a light to at least partially see it before they begin throwing the darts, isn't how reality works. Religious belief isn't something people hold to with no evidence. Nor is there even such a thing as the religious method to contrast to the scientific method. The whole idea that science and religion are opposing forces that work at a fundamentally different level and come into conflict with each other is a disproven idea. And religious belief is a complex topic, with religion itself not being so much a methodology like science as being a culture or personal identity, and covering a range of things from art to philosophy to culture to identity. Religion isn't a method that religious people use as opposed to the scientific method which atheists use. It is a complex series of rituals and histories and stories and narratives and beliefs and ideals. It is something that grew organically over time and is not really fixed to any one thing like science would be. There is no religious method, and it simply isn't true that religious people simply believe that their holy book is true because they were told it was as a child, or blindly believe religious authorities. It simply isn't true that religious people just uncritically accept what people tell them. And it doesn't really matter if the universe being complex like it is disproves God, or at the very least proves that God is no genius, because a genius would want the simplest universe possible, and an all-perfect God would create nothing since he would be content in himself. That is beside the point. Even if God doesn't exist, that doesn't mean religious people believe in God even though they have no evidence of his existence. As complicated as this may be for some people to understand, Just because a belief is wrong does not mean that it is not based on evidence. It could just be that you are misunderstanding the evidence. Furthermore, even if he's right and God is no genius because he made an overly complicated universe, that alone doesn't prove God doesn't exist. Not that it matters, as the argument for the universe's complexity isn't that compelling either, nor is it really compelling to say that a genius would never produce something complex. But again, I'm not going into detail about that. What's really important right now is that faith isn't understood in the context of religion as belief without evidence, and religious people put more thought into their religious beliefs than they are being given credit for. There is more complexity to religion than just fairy tales with no evidence that people believe in because they were told it's true and they never question it. It simply isn't true that religious people are throwing darts blindly in a dark room without even knowing there's a dartboard. Religious people do have their own flashlight that they can use to see if there's a dartboard there or not. Religious thought is more complex and more nuanced than he was giving it credit for, and no amount of arguing that the complexity of the universe proves God doesn't exist, or at the very least isn't a genius, really makes that go away. And that's the point. It was obvious that the atheist I was talking to was like a lot of militant atheists. He has a script that he reads from, and that he relies so heavily upon that he really can't adapt to what is being said in the actual conversations. He already knows how religious people think because the atheist community has told him, and he also knows what arguments a religious person will make and how to rebut them. But what he doesn't understand is that not all religious people are actually making the arguments he's rebutting, nor are they interested in diverting to these other issues when the one they started with is not resolved. Militant atheists do this quite often, though. They tend to be so cocksure of their arguments that they make them, even if it is at an inappropriate time or does not truly respond to what the other person is saying. They will frequently jump to new arguments because they want to get to that point because it is a script and because their focus is on proving religion is not true. That science, not religion, gives us the truth. Their entire focus is on proving a narrative, and they're not really interested in actually addressing faults that they may have in specific points of their argument. They're looking at it as a whole. It doesn't matter if they're right about this one point or not, since they have this other thing over here that proves them right. And it doesn't matter if you disprove the second argument, because they'll just jump to a third, a fourth, a fifth, a sixth, a seventh. And that's sort of the issue. Whether God exists or not has nothing to do with whether or not faith in the context of religion means belief without evidence, or even if religious people just blindly accept what they're told. These arguments were unrelated to the point being made, and yet he acted as if I committed a logical fallacy by not addressing them. As if I didn't get it. As if he had presented a brilliant argument, and as a religious person, I just didn't understand it, and he had to restate it. But he wasn't restating an argument, he was presenting another argument that was unrelated to the one I was addressing. Or he acted as if I made an argument I didn't make that had nothing to do with what we were talking about. This doesn't allow for real communication. It doesn't allow for real conversation. And yet it happens frequently. For instance, it is very popular in the atheist community to claim that Adolf Hitler and the Nazis were Christians. That, what's more, the Catholic Church fully endorsed and supported Hitler and the Nazi ideals. This is sheer nonsense. The Catholic Church condemned the Nazis, and they were actually excommunicated in 1933. But most atheists would deny that, at least the militant variety. And those that don't would try and salvage the argument by saying, "But you missed the point! Germany was majority Christian, and obviously most of the rank and file Nazis saw themselves as Christian, so it's clear that the Christians were supporting the Nazis, so they obviously saw no problem with supporting Nazis and being a Christian." But that wasn't the argument they were making, and it wasn't the one you were addressing. Even if it's true that Christianity is fundamentally flawed, and it's easy to align Christianity to Nazi beliefs, that still wouldn't make Hitler a Christian, or prove that the Nazis viewed their movement as a particularly Christian one. So what's the point? Some would even go further than that, though, and then start invoking things like the Spanish Inquisition, and act like because your argument didn't address the Spanish Inquisition, you just didn't get it, and you're not smart enough to realize what the real point is. Even though a moment ago they were talking about Hitler and the Nazis, and it's obvious you weren't going to bring up the Spanish Inquisition. And that's kind of the issue that I was bringing up. A lot of atheists have bought into the mythos that atheists are rational and well-educated and logical, and religious people aren't, and they've bought into the mythos that religious belief is irrational and it's not based on evidence, but it's fairly obvious that this is a tactic they use in order to justify seeing people that way. And it's equally obvious that, really, the contrast between religious people and atheists is non-existent. The atheist is just as religious, and in fact has the same flaws to religion that they are condemning. And it doesn't matter if you say atheism isn't a religion, it's a lack of belief in a god, or talk about not collecting stamps being a hobby, or bald being a hair color, because the point I'm making is the same, and you're proving that point by saying bald is a hair color, or not collecting stamps is a hobby. You are avoiding the real argument, and shifting the blame to something else, and acting as if I miss the point, when in reality you're the one avoiding the point. It's sort of the issue that I have with modern militant atheists. They don't really try and have an honest conversation, and will drop points or pretend they never made the points they were making to try and depict you as a fool when you're really not. It's irritating because it makes having a real conversation impossible, and yet it happens quite frequently. At any rate, I don't have much else to say, so thank you, God bless, and goodbye.